Consider this English word, photograph, photograph. Now let's look at a transcription that shows how the word is really pronounced. Let's zero in here on one important issue. That second letter O doesn't really sound like the first. It's not really an O sound at all. It's more of an indistinct sound. That's because it's in an unstressed syllable, and when a vowel in English is not stressed, it's often reduced. That is, we pronounce it less clearly, less distinctly. Most Russian vowels are also reduced when they're not stressed, and in fact, vowel reduction like this is a really important part in standard Russian pronunciation. In this video, we'll cover a and o, which are reduced in a couple of different ways depending on where they are in the word. When they are unstressed at the end of a word, they'll sound like this.
Было. Много. Ольга. Тула.
You'll hear a similar sound when they're unstressed and at the beginning of a word.
Она. Обещал. Албанка.
And you'll hear that same sound when the letters o or a come right before the stressed syllable.
Потом. Погода. Дала. Гараж.
So, when they're unstressed at the beginning of a word, at the end of a word, or right before the stress, you'll hear this same sound. But that leaves one position we haven't talked about yet. What about the second syllable back from the stressed syllable? Not right before the stress, but even farther back. In this position, o and a will be reduced even more to a very quick sound.
Хорошо. Дорогой. Новослободская. Заняла.
You can also hear this sound after the stressed syllable, as long as it's not right at the end of the word.
40. Город. Холод. Новгород.
But at the end of the word again, it's not reduced quite so much. Listen for the subtle differences in how the letter O sounds in this word.
Около. Около.
And here's a special note for English speakers. Let's take a close look at two words that would seem to have similar stress patterns. They're both longer words, both stressed on the third syllable. Photographic.
Фотография.
Listen again to the English and say it along with me if you like. Photographic, photographic. Do you hear that strong stress on graph, the third syllable? The first syllable has a weak stress, and the syllable in between, right before the main stress, is the weakest of all. Photographic. We can visualize this English pattern like this. Now listen carefully and see if you can hear how the Russian pattern is different.
Фотография. Фотография.
Again, we've got the strong stress on graf, on the third syllable, but the syllable right before the main stress gets a weak stress. And this first syllable, that's even farther away from the stress, is not stressed at all. So that gives a very different pattern. Now here's a good one to practice with. Speakers of English might be tempted to map our English stress pattern onto a Russian word, and then you would end up saying something like хорошо, хорошо. But that's really not very good, is it? Let's be sure instead to use the Russian stress pattern. Right before the stress, we have the weak accent for an a sound, and the first syllable is completely unaccented with a very indistinct Sounds much nicer.
Хорошо. Хорошо.
This may seem like a lot of rules if you're just beginning with Russian. The problem is, if you're not in Russia, you may be seeing Russian in print more often than you hear it. But still, try not to be deceived by the spellings. Instead, listen as much as you can so that pronunciations like
Город.
and
Города.
come to feel natural. In fact, let's practice that a little here, first listening and repeating before you see the word.
Около. Около. Город. Город. Новгород. Новгород. Погода. Погода. Хорошо. Хорошо. Таганрог. Таганрог.
It can be a challenge for learners to pronounce what they see correctly, but Russian children, native speakers, sometimes have the opposite problem. They make spelling mistakes. They know how to pronounce everything perfectly, of course, but since a and o both reduce in the same way, it can be hard to know just by hearing a word like
Водопад.
whether the unstressed or a sounds should be spelled with the letters A or O. There's a nice illustration of that with Крокодил Гена in this classic animated film Чебурашка, and here he's trying to figure out how to spell крокодил. Крокодил. Should it be крокодил? Is it крокодил or something else?
Молодой Нет. Крокодил.
Actually, both letters should be O, like in the English crocodile, but I think Gena does get it wrong here. Summing up, most Russian vowels in unstressed syllables are reduced, that is, they're pronounced less clearly. Unstressed O and A are somewhat reduced at the beginning and the end of the word,
Обещал. Много.
and right before the stressed syllable.
Вода.
O and A are reduced even more when they're not directly before the stressed syllable.
Новослободская. Новгород.
If you're a beginner, you may be trying hard to learn the alphabet still, but it's just as important, maybe even more important, to listen as much as possible. Especially when it comes to vowels, be sure to trust your ears more than your eyes.